At 4:22 p.m., I stood outside the ballroom doors while the music played without me. The bride said I was a different class, and my own son did not stop her. What happens when the man you humiliate is the one holding the quiet legal keys you never bothered to check? At 2:47 p.m., I parked behind the wedding venue and sat in my truck for a full minute before I got out. The building was a bright stone place with tall windows and a clean sign out front. The parking lot was full of rented cars that looked too polished for real life. I could hear music through the walls, soft and steady, like the building was already pretending everything was perfect. I checked my tie in the mirror and adjusted my collar. My suit was not new, but it was clean. I smelled faint laundry soap on the sleeve and a little leather from the old seat under me. I held a small gift box on my lap, wrapped in simple paper with a neat ribbon. I had picked it because I thought it was right, not because it was expensive. I walked toward the side entrance at 2:55 p.m. The air was cool with the smell of wet grass and exhaust. A delivery van was unloading flowers. A worker carried a long white cloth like it was fragile. I moved around them quietly. I did not want attention. I only wanted to be a father on my son's day, to stand in the back if I had to see him smile, and to feel that I still belonged somewhere. At the loading dock, a young coordinator stepped in front of me. She wore a headset and held a clipboard tight against her chest. She asked my name. I told her. Her face changed in a small way, like she had heard it before and did not like what it meant. She said, in indirect speech, that there was a change in the plan and that I should wait outside the ballroom entrance. She said it quickly, like repeating a rule. I asked if there was a problem. She said, in indirect speech, that it was not a problem, it was just a change. She added that the bride requested it. When she said bride, I felt a slow heat in my chest, but my face stayed calm. I had met Winnie Cade only a few times. Every time, she spoke like she was sorting people into boxes. I told myself she was young and nervous. I told myself it was wedding stress. I believed that because it was easier than believing a person could be cruel on purpose. I walked toward the main doors anyway at 3:05 p.m. The foyer smelled like fresh flowers and expensive perfume. The floor shined under the lights. A sign with calligraphy pointed toward the ballroom. I saw guests in bright suits and dresses. Some faces turned toward me for a moment, then turned away. That is how people avoid discomfort. They look and then pretend they did not. I stepped closer to the ballroom doors, and that is when Winnie appeared. She was not alone. 2 bridesmaids walked with her like a moving wall. A venue staff member followed, holding a tablet. Winnie's dress was white and perfect, and her smile was sharp, like it belonged in a photo, not in a real room. She did not greet me like family. She looked me up and down, slow, as if my clothes were dirt on her floor. Winnie said, in indirect speech, that this wedding had a certain image and that I did not fit it. She said we were a different class. She said it like it was a fact, like the weather. She said she did not want me in the ballroom. She also said my presence would bring the wrong energy. She waved one hand toward the staff member like she was dismissing a waiter. The staff member looked uncomfortable, but still moved. He said, in indirect speech, that he had instructions and he needed me to step away from the doors. I looked past Winnie and saw my son, Mason, near the edge of the ballroom. He wore a suit that looked more expensive than mine. His hair was neat. He was smiling at someone. Then he saw me, and his smile faded. He froze the way a person freezes when they see trouble but hope it will vanish. I did not shout. I did not ask the whole room to listen. I only looked at Mason and waited. Winnie looked at him too, like she was checking if he would obey her. Mason walked closer, slow, and stopped near Winnie. He did not stand beside me. He stood beside her. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. Mason said, in indirect speech, that he was sorry and that it was complicated. He said Winnie was under stress and there were donors and family expectations. He said it was only for today and asked me to cooperate. He said he would talk to me later. His voice sounded thin, like he was borrowing it from someone else. I saw his eyes avoid mine. I saw him blink too fast. He looked like a boy again for a second, scared of getting in trouble. Winnie's smile grew, like she had won a small game. She said, in indirect speech, that I should not ruin the moment and that a good father would step aside quietly. She said it loud enough for nearby guests to hear. A few people turned their heads. A woman in a blue dress stopped speaking mid-sentence. A man with a drink paused and watched. Nobody said anything. Silence can be its own cruelty. I felt something heavy settle inside me. It was not only embarrassment, it was a clear realization that this was not an accident. The coordinator at the dock, the staff member with the tablet, The way Winnie moved with confidence, all of it was planned. This was not a sudden, emotional moment. This was a decision made in advance. I held the gift box out and asked the staff member to take it inside since I was not allowed. My voice stayed calm, my hands did not shake. The staff member hesitated, then took it. Winnie watched with a look that said she expected me to beg instead. Mason stared at the floor. I nodded once, not because I agreed, but because I was done giving them more of my dignity to play with. I turned and walked away at 3:18 p.m. My shoes made a soft sound on the shiny floor. The farther I walked, the more I could hear the music again, still playing, still happy, as if nothing happened. My throat felt tight. My face stayed still. I did not want to cry in a hallway full of strangers. I also did not want to explode. I have been on job sites where one wrong move can crush a person. You learn to control your hands. You learn to control your voice. I used those same skills now. Outside, the air was colder. I walked into the parking garage stairwell beside the venue at 3:22 p.m. The concrete walls smelled like damp stone and oil. The echo of my steps sounded lonely. I stood on a landing and stared at a yellow safety line painted on the floor. It was a simple line, meant to prevent falls. I thought about how my own life had safety lines too, rules I lived by. Respect your family, work hard, do not embarrass people, do not make problems in public. I realized those rules only protect you when others share them. My phone was in my pocket. I did not want to call anyone at first. Calling felt like admitting weakness. But then I remembered something my late wife used to say when business got messy. She used to say that systems matter more than emotions because systems do not get tired. I had a system I trusted, even if I did not use it often. I had a private banker. At 3:26 p.m., I called Vesper Hale. She had been my banker for years, the kind of person who speaks in careful sentences and never promises what she cannot deliver. I had met her first when I sold part of my construction company and moved money into safer places. She did not talk down to me. She did not pretend I was a simple man. She spoke like I mattered. Vesper answered after 2 rings. She asked if everything was okay. I told her, in indirect speech, that I needed a private meeting as soon as possible and that it was about account activity connected to a family event. I did not mention the word wedding yet. I did not mention humiliation. I stayed on facts. There was a pause. Then Vesper said, in indirect speech, that she could meet, but she needed to ask one question first. She asked if I authorized any recent transfers related to the Cade family accounts or a celebration fund. The phrase celebration fund made my chest tighten. I asked what she meant. Vesper said, in indirect speech, that she could not discuss details over the phone, but she could confirm she saw recent activity tied to a fund name that matched the wedding sponsor line. She said she noticed it because it touched an internal structure connected to my legacy accounts. I stood very still in the stairwell. The concrete wall felt cold behind my shoulder. I asked Vesper if my name was on that fund. She said, in indirect speech, that there was a structure tied to my name and my banking relationship, but the exact control points needed a private conversation. She also said something else, softer. She said the timing mattered, and she recommended we meet before more decisions were made. She said she could hold certain actions from moving forward if we acted quickly and lawfully. I asked when she could see me. Vesper said, in indirect speech, that she had a slot at 9 a.m. the next morning in her office. She said it was private, not in the main lobby. She said I should bring identification and any relevant invitations or sponsor references if I had them. I said I would be there. Then I ended the call and stood in silence for a moment. A door opened downstairs and someone laughed. The sound traveled up the stairwell and faded. I realized my son's wedding was still going on without me, and people were still smiling inside. I felt a sting behind my eyes. I swallowed it down. I did not want tears to make me sloppy. Sloppy gets you hurt. At 3:40 p.m., I walked out of the garage stairwell and toward my truck. My hands were steady, but my thoughts were sharp now. Winnie called me a different class, but what she really did was test how much she could control me in public. She expected me to argue and beg because that would prove her story. She expected me to look like the rough father who does not belong. Instead, I left quietly and I made one phone call to a system she did not understand. As I drove away at 3:47 p.m., my phone buzzed with a message from Mason. He said, in indirect speech, that he was sorry and that he would explain later. He asked me not to be angry. He asked me not to embarrass Winnie. I did not answer. I saved the message. I wrote the time in my notebook when I got home, because I could already feel that this would not end with feelings. It would end with records. At 4:18 p.m., I sat at my kitchen table again, still wearing the suit I wore to be accepted. The house smelled like wood and old books. The silence felt thick. I placed the empty gift bag on the table and stared at it. Then I opened my notebook and wrote one line, clear and simple, like a plan on a job site. Meet Vesper Hale, 9 a.m., private office. At 8:12 a.m. the next morning, I drove to Northgate Private Bank in a plain jacket, not my suit. I did not want to look like I was coming to fight. I wanted to look like I was coming to listen. The streets were damp again. A thin fog sat over the roofs. My hand stayed steady on the wheel, but my mind kept replaying the foyer scene. The bride's smile, the staff member's tablet, my son's eyes sliding away. I did not let myself get stuck there. I kept telling myself one thing. Facts first. I parked in the underground lot at 8:43 a.m. The air down there smelled like concrete dust and exhaust. I walked to the elevator and watched the floor numbers light up. When the doors opened, a quiet lobby greeted me. Soft music, clean marble, a scent like citrus that felt too perfect. I gave my name at the front desk. The receptionist looked at her screen and then nodded with a careful expression. She said, in indirect speech, that Ms. Hale was expecting me and that I should follow a staff member to a private office. A young man led me down a hallway with frosted glass walls. The carpet was thick enough to swallow footstep sounds. It made the place feel like secrets could live here. He stopped at a door with no name on it. He knocked once, then opened it and gestured me inside. Vesper Hale stood by a window with blinds half closed. The light cut her face into calm lines. She wore a dark blazer and held a slim folder in her hand, but she did not open it. She offered a seat. Her office smelled like paper and faint perfume. Clean, but not warm. I sat with my hands on my knees like I did in meetings my whole life. If you sit relaxed, people assume you have nothing to lose. If you sit steady, people assume you came prepared. Vesper said, in indirect speech, that she was sorry I had a difficult day yesterday. She said she could not comment on family behavior, but she could confirm there were financial movements connected to a fund name she recognized. She asked if I brought anything with the fund name on it. I pulled the wedding invitation from my jacket pocket. I had grabbed it from the kitchen counter before I left. I placed it on the desk without sliding it too far, like it was evidence, but not a weapon. Vesper looked at the sponsor line and gave a small nod. She said, in indirect speech, that this was the name she saw in the system. She said it was labeled as a celebration fund, but labels can be misleading. She said it touched a banking structure connected to my history. She used careful words, like she was walking around a hole in the floor. She said there were payments initiated and inquiries made that suggested someone believed they had authority to use that fund. I asked if the money was mine. Vesper did not answer directly. She said, in indirect speech, that the structure was connected to my accounts. But control and benefit are not always the same thing. She said there can be governance rules, conditions, and oversight. She said those rules exist to protect people and to keep funds from being misused in ways that create liability. When she said liability, I thought of job sites again. Liability is what shows up when someone ignores rules and then acts surprised. I asked what the fund was used for. Vesper said, in indirect speech, that she could not give detailed transaction lists in this meeting without counsel present, because the matter now touched compliance and potential dispute. She said it was important for me to understand one thing. She said the bank had preserved activity records, and the bank took reputational coercion and unauthorized use seriously, especially when a family event was used to pressure someone. She said yesterday's ejection and the sudden activity were part of why she wanted to speak privately. I felt my throat tighten. I asked how she knew about the ejection. Vesper said, in indirect speech, that she did not know the whole story, but she received internal notes connected to communications from a venue vendor and a fund administrator inquiry. She said people leave traces without realizing it. She said when someone tries to move money quickly, they often touch too many systems at once. I asked what I should do. Vesper leaned forward slightly and spoke in a slower tone. She said in indirect speech that the worst thing I could do was confront the bride or her family in public. She said public conflict makes records messy. She said the best thing I could do was formalize representation and let communications go through counsel. She said if the fund was being used under false assumptions, the bank could pause further actions once proper notice was given. She said timing mattered. I asked if there was a trigger, like she hinted yesterday. Vesper held my eyes for a moment, then nodded once. She said in indirect speech that certain structures include conditions that respond to misconduct. She said those conditions can involve reputational harm, coercion, and misuse of authority. She said the bank does not enjoy enforcing those conditions, but the bank will follow what is written if the correct process is used. She did not show me paper. She did not read me a clause. She only confirmed a shape exists. That was enough to make my stomach settle into a cold certainty. I asked if my son was involved in the financial activity. Vesper said, in indirect speech, that names appeared in the trail, but she could not share full details in a private conversation without a formal request path. She said she would cooperate with my attorney. She said she also recommended I preserve any messages or statements from the bride or her family that showed intent, especially anything about class, exclusion, or pressure. She said those things matter because motive is not just money. Motive can also be control. I sat back and looked at my hands. They were rough, but clean. I thought about the way Winnie looked at my suit like it was trash. I thought about how she said class like it was a weapon. I realized she did not only want me out of a ballroom, she wanted me out of the story completely. She wanted me to be a background figure who paid and stayed quiet. Vesper asked, in indirect speech, if I had a lawyer. I said I did not yet. Vesper gave me a simple recommendation. She said I needed a contract and trust attorney with calm judgment. She did not push a name hard. She simply said the bank worked well with attorneys who understood process and did not turn everything into drama. At 9:38 a.m., I left the bank and drove home without stopping. I did not feel rage. I felt focused. I walked into my garage workshop at 10:05 a.m. The smell of sawdust and oil hit me like a memory. Tools hung on the wall in straight lines. A tape measure sat on the bench where I always left it. The garage was my honest place. In here, if something is crooked, you can measure it. In families, crooked hides behind smiles. I sat on the stool and opened the gift bag I carried home yesterday. Inside was nothing but tissue paper and the small card I wrote for Mason. I did not read it again. I placed it back and looked around the garage until my eyes landed on the wedding invitation on the bench. I had set it there last night. I picked it up and read the sponsor line again, slow. Cade Family Celebration Fund. Below it, smaller, the venue thanked their partners. The whole thing looked like a polished announcement, but now I knew it was also a keyhole. At 10:40 a.m., Perry arrived. She knocked once and stepped into the garage like she was afraid to disturb my silence. Her face was tight with anger. She said, in indirect speech, that she saw Winnie's online posts. She said Winnie was bragging in private group chats about finally cleaning the guest list. She said Winnie wrote that I was embarrassing. She said Winnie wrote that class mattered and that some people should stay in their lane. Perry held her phone out, but I did not take it right away. I asked Perry to sit and breathe. Perry sat on a folding chair and scrolled carefully. She showed me screenshots without adding insults. The words were there, bright on the screen, cruel and confident. Winnie was not just excluding me, she was making it a statement. I asked Perry to send everything to me and to save it with dates. Perry said she already did, and she backed it up in 2 places. That made me feel a small warmth in my chest. Not happiness, just relief that someone in my family still understood procedure. At 11:15 a.m., my phone buzzed with a message from Corbin Cade. The last time Corbin texted me was months ago, a shallow holiday greeting. Today his message was direct. He said in indirect speech that there were final vendor payments that needed to be handled and that there was confusion about signatures. He said he needed to meet quickly to fix it. He said the venue and partners wanted a clean sign-off. He said if I helped, it would keep everything smooth. I stared at the message for a long moment. The language was smooth, but the request was sharp. Signatures. Meet quickly. Keep it smooth. That is how people talk when they are trying to push a paper through a crack before someone sees it. Perry saw my face change and asked what happened. I told her Corbin wanted me to sign something. Perry's eyes widened. She said, in indirect speech, that Winnie told people I was unstable, yet now they wanted my signature. That contradiction told me everything about their real belief. They did not think I was incompetent. They thought I was inconvenient. I did not respond to Corbin. I took a screenshot and wrote the time. Then another message came from Mason at 11:22 a.m. Mason said, in indirect speech, that Corbin was only trying to help and that I should meet him to avoid problems. Mason said Winnie was stressed and asked me to be the bigger person. He also said he did not want drama. He said he wanted a peaceful start to marriage. The words sounded soft, but they landed like a demand. I sat on the stool and looked at the garage floor. I could almost hear the ballroom music in my memory. I could almost see Winnie's smile. I realized they wanted to use the humiliation as a lever. They wanted me to feel small and then sign something out of fear or shame. That is not class. That is manipulation. At 11:40 a.m., I went inside and sat at my kitchen table. The house smelled like toast and old wood. I placed my notebook open and wrote down 3 lines. Bank meeting, fund name, Corbin signature request. I circled the word signatures twice. Then I looked at the business card Vesper hinted I would need, not her card, but the idea of counsel. At 11:52 a.m., I called Al McKean. I had not spoken to her in years, not since she helped a friend of mine handle a contract dispute without ruining anyone's life. She answered in a calm voice. I introduced myself and said, in indirect speech, that my son's wedding turned into a public exclusion, and now a celebration fund tied to my banking history was being used in ways I did not authorize. I said I needed a lawyer who could move quietly and lawfully. Alma paused for one moment, then said, in indirect speech, that she could meet today, and she told me to bring the invitation, the messages, and my calm. At 1:18 p.m., I walked into Alma Keene's office with the wedding invitation folded in my jacket pocket and my phone set to silent. The hallway smelled like copier toner and lemon cleaner. A small clock ticked on the wall, steady and patient. The receptionist asked my name and pointed me to a conference room with a plain table and 2 chairs. The room felt like the opposite of the wedding venue. No perfume, no music, no performance. Just quiet air and the soft hum of fluorescent lights. Alma came in at 1:26 p.m. She carried a thin folder and a pen. She did not act surprised. She did not act excited. She looked at me like a professional who had seen families turn into legal problems before. She asked in indirect speech what happened and what I wanted. I told her I wanted 2 things. I wanted my name protected. I wanted any money connected to me protected. I told her I did not want revenge through chaos. I wanted a lawful answer that could not be argued away. Alma asked me to start with the wedding, not the bank. She said in indirect speech that motive often begins with humiliation and control, not with numbers. I told her the details in simple steps. I told her the coordinator blocked me at the loading dock. I told her Winnie said I was a different class. I told her staff tried to escort me away. I told her Mason did not stop it. Alma wrote down the times I remembered and asked me to repeat the exact phrases Winnie used. When I said different class, Alma paused her pen for a second, then continued writing. She asked if anyone recorded it. I said I did not know, but the venue had cameras and staff. Then Alma asked about the fund. I placed the invitation on the table and pointed at the sponsor line. Alma read it and asked in indirect speech if I knew what it was. I said I did not. I said my banker, Vesper Hale, hinted the name touched something connected to my accounts. Alma nodded once. She said in indirect speech that fund language often hides real ownership and authority rules. She said we would treat it like a business dispute first, because that keeps emotions out of it. She also said we would not show our hand early. She said the other side would adjust if they knew what we knew. Alma asked if I had messages. I told her I had a text from Corbin asking for signatures and a text from Mason pushing me to meet him. I told her Perry had screenshots of Winnie's posts. Alma asked me, in indirect speech, to preserve everything with timestamps and not to respond to provocation. She said every reaction I gave them could become a narrative against me. She said Winnie already started building a story that I was bitter and unstable. She said the cleanest way to break that story was calm consistency. At 2:05 p.m., Perry arrived at Alma's office. Perry's cheeks were red from cold air and anger. She sat down and opened her phone carefully. She showed Alma the screenshots. Winnie wrote about class and clean guest lists. Winnie wrote that I did not belong. Winnie wrote like she was proud. Alma did not react with shock. She only asked Perry, in indirect speech, to forward everything and to keep original files. She said metadata matters. Perry nodded and did it right there, slow and careful. Alma asked me if I had any connection to donors or partners listed on the invitation. I said I had business connections in town, but I kept my life private. I said I sold part of my company years ago and moved money into safer places. Alma asked what kind of company. I said, construction. Alma's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in focus. She said, in indirect speech, that construction people often build networks without showing them. She asked if any past projects involved sponsorships, community funds, or legacy accounts. I told her I had supported apprenticeships and a local trade program. I told her I never wanted my name on a wall. Alma wrote that down and said, in indirect speech, that quiet support often creates quiet structures. She said we needed to identify what the celebration fund really was without waking up the wrong people. At 3:10 p.m., Alma told me her plan for the next step. She said she would contact the bank through proper channels and request preservation of records tied to the fund name and any connected payments. She said she would also send a preservation notice to the venue for any incident reports and relevant footage windows. She said we would not demand things loudly. We would request them cleanly, because clean requests get clean responses. She said if Corbin pushed signatures again, I must not meet him. She said if I needed to answer anything, I would say communications go through counsel. Short, boring, strong. When I left Alma's office at 3:35 p.m., the sky was darker, like late afternoon arrived early. The air smelled like rain. I drove to my old construction yard office at 4:05 p.m. The yard was quiet now, fewer trucks than before. The gravel crunched under my tires. The building smelled like dust, coffee, and old plywood. A faded safety poster hung on the wall. I sat at the desk and opened a drawer where I kept old project folders. I did not pull out anything dramatic. I did not open sealed envelopes. I only looked at my own history, the work we did, the contracts we honored, the projects we funded. It reminded me of one thing. I built my life on procedures. Winnie built her life on appearances. At 4:42 p.m., I drove toward the country club area on a quiet hunch. I did not go inside. I did not want confrontation. I parked on a side street where I could see the patio through a row of thin trees. The sun was low and made the windows glow. I watched people in clean coats and bright scarves laugh like nothing could touch them. Then I saw Winnie. She sat at a table with Corbin and two older couples. Mason sat beside Winnie, stiff and quiet. Winnie leaned forward and spoke with confident hands. Corbin nodded and smiled too wide. I could not hear their words, but I could read body language like I read job sites. Winnie was performing control. Corbin was selling reassurance. Mason was agreeing without joy. I saw Winnie gesture as if pointing at a problem far away, then lift her chin like she solved it. I guessed that problem was me. One of the older men leaned back and laughed. Winnie laughed too, then looked down at her phone. Corbin pulled out a folder and tapped it once, like he was emphasizing a point. Mason looked at the folder and then looked away. The sight of that folder made my skin go cold. Paper in the hands of the wrong person can be worse than fists. Paper can steal without leaving bruises. At 5:10 p.m., my phone buzzed. A message from Corbin appeared. Corbin said, in indirect speech, that he was trying to save everyone embarrassment and that I needed to sign a vendor release to finalize the celebration fund. He said the venue demanded it. He said the bank was being slow and that my signature would clear confusion. He added that we could meet at a notary storefront near the highway in 30 minutes. The speed of the request was the tell. Honest business does not demand urgent signatures after humiliating someone in public. I did not reply. I took a screenshot and sent it to Alma. Alma responded fast. She said in indirect speech that Corbin was trying to manufacture consent. She told me not to go. She told me to stay home and let her handle it. She also said one more thing that made my stomach tighten. She said we should assume they would try to paint me as unstable if I refused, so my refusal must be calm and consistent. At 5:18 p.m., Mason called me. I watched the phone ring until it stopped. Then I received a voicemail. Mason said, in indirect speech, that Corbin was only trying to help and that I should meet him to keep peace. Mason said Winnie was stressed and asked me to be the bigger person. Mason also said he did not want the wedding to become a story people tell. The irony made my throat feel tight. The wedding already became a story the moment Winnie kicked me out. Mason just wanted it to be a story where I stayed silent. At 6:02 p.m., I drove home and sat at my kitchen table with the invitation and my notebook. The house smelled like old wood and clean dish soap. The quiet felt heavy, but it also felt safe. I wrote down the country club time. I wrote down Corbin's message and Mason's voicemail. Then I stared at the sponsor line again. Cade Family Celebration Fund. The name looked like a trophy. I understood now it might be a disguise. At 6:40 p.m., Winnie posted again. Perry forwarded it to me without adding commentary. Winnie wrote in indirect speech that some people cannot handle being told the truth about class. She wrote that she would not let outsiders ruin her family's future. She did not use my name, but she did not need to. The target was clear. At 7:15 p.m., Alma called and asked if I had gone anywhere near Corbin. I said no. I told her about the country club sighting and the folder. Alma said in indirect speech that observation is fine, but no contact is better. She said she would send a formal notice to Corbin that all communications go through counsel. She said she would also send a preservation request to the venue for the incident report and relevant footage windows. She said we were building a case file piece by piece, like framing a house. She said we did not need to rush. She said we needed to be correct. At 8:05 p.m., someone knocked on my door. I looked through the window first. Mason stood on my porch alone, hands in his pockets, shoulders sagging. I opened the door halfway. Mason said, in indirect speech, that he needed to talk. He said Winnie was furious and Corbin was panicking. He said the venue was asking questions about payments and authority. He said the bank was not cooperating the way they expected. His voice sounded like he was losing control of a machine he helped start. I told Mason, in indirect speech, that I would speak through my attorney now. I told him I loved him, but I would not sign anything and I would not meet Corbin. Mason's eyes filled, but he did not cry. He asked me in indirect speech what I was planning. I told him I was planning to protect myself lawfully. Mason swallowed and said Winnie would never forgive him if he lost control of the money. That sentence landed like a confession. Control of the money mattered more than forgiveness, more than family. Mason stepped back and said, in indirect speech, that maybe it would be easier if I just apologized and stayed away. He said I could keep dignity by disappearing. I held the door steady and said no. Mason nodded once, like he understood, but also like he feared what would happen next. When he left, I locked the door and sat at the table again. My phone buzzed with a message from Corbin. Corbin said, in indirect speech, that if I did not sign tonight, vendors would pull out and the Cade family would be publicly embarrassed. He said I would be blamed. He said he did not want it to get ugly. I saved the message and wrote the time. At 9:12 p.m., Alma texted me one sentence that felt like a hinge turning. She said she confirmed the dinner date Winnie planned, and she said the guest list would include the exact witnesses we needed. Then she added another sentence, quieter but heavier. She said the morning of that dinner was the right time to file because the consequences would land while Winnie was still performing. I stared at the screen in the quiet kitchen and felt the air change. Winnie thought she was building a stage where I would be erased. Alma was turning that same stage into a courtroom without a judge present. I turned my phone face down and wrote one last line in my notebook, simple and clear, because I knew the next step would come fast. Tomorrow, we lock timing and venue. At 6:30 a.m., I woke up with my jaw tight and my hands calm. The house was still. The heater clicked once and went quiet again. I made coffee and did not taste it. I sat at the kitchen table and opened my notebook. I read my last line from last night, then wrote the date at the top of a new page. When you build something strong, you start with a clean line. At 7:12 a.m., Alma called. She said in indirect speech that she sent a formal notice to Corbin and Winnie that all communications go through counsel. She said she also sent a preservation notice to the wedding venue for the incident window, staff notes, and any security footage. She told me to expect escalation. She said people who try to control a story do not like being told to stop touching the paper. At 8:05 a.m., I drove to a notary storefront near the highway, not to sign, not to argue, only to observe. The building sat between a tax prep office and a shipping store. A neon notary sign buzzed in the window like an insect. The parking lot smelled like wet asphalt. I parked across the street and watched through my windshield. I kept my phone face down. I did not want to look like I was hunting. I wanted to look like a man waiting for a friend. At 8:24 a.m., Corbin arrived in a dark SUV. He walked fast, shoulders tight, eyes scanning the lot. He carried a folder pressed against his ribs like it was fragile. He went inside and the door shut behind him. I watched the window. A woman in a cardigan moved behind the counter. Corbin leaned forward and spoke with quick gestures. He pointed at the folder, then at his watch. The notary shook her head once, then looked down at a screen. Corbin's face tightened. He stepped back, then leaned in again like he was bargaining. Even from across the street, I could see the pattern. He was trying to force a signature through a system that wants clarity. At 8:39 a.m., Corbin came back outside and made a call in the parking lot. His free hand chopped the air. His posture looked angry, but his eyes looked scared. He said something into the phone and then looked around again, like he expected me to appear and rescue him. I stayed in my truck and kept my face neutral. After a minute, he got back in his SUV and drove away fast. I wrote down the time and the location in my notebook before I started my engine. I did not write guesses, I wrote facts. Notary storefront. Corbin entered with folder. Corbin exited angry. That was enough. At 9:30 a.m., I met Alma at a small hotel business center across town. It was a quiet place with a carpeted lobby and a smell of warm air and cheap soap. The business center was a little room with 2 computers, a printer, and a desk lamp that flickered slightly. Alma chose it because it was neutral ground. No one from my neighborhood. No one from the Cades' social circle. No theater. Alma opened her laptop and said, in indirect speech, that we were building a case file that could survive scrutiny. She said we would keep chain of custody clean. She said every screenshot should be saved with date and time and backed up in a way that proves it was not edited later. She said we would not show any big document yet. She said big documents come at the end when the other side cannot adjust. Perry arrived at 10:05 a.m. with a calm face and a careful hand. She handed Alma a USB drive and said, in indirect speech, that she saved Winnie's posts, group chat messages, and 2 voice notes Winnie sent to relatives. Alma did not plug the drive in right away. She labeled it first with a date, then photographed it beside a printed timestamp page. Alma moved like a person who has done this before. It was not dramatic, it was disciplined. Alma asked Perry what Winnie was saying now. Perry said, in indirect speech, that Winnie was telling people I was unstable and bitter. Perry said Winnie also told people I was trying to sabotage the marriage because I was jealous of their class. Perry said Winnie was inviting donors and friends to a thank you dinner at a luxury restaurant in 30 days to celebrate fresh beginnings. Perry said Winnie described it like a public reset, a way to make the wedding look even bigger and cleaner in photos. Alma's eyes narrowed slightly when she heard the dinner detail. She asked for the restaurant name. Perry said it was called Briar House. Alma wrote it down and circled it once. She did not explain why yet. At 10:42 a.m., Alma asked me to print my timeline. I printed it in simple pages. Each page had times, places, and short descriptions. The printer made a low mechanical sound. The paper came out warm. Alma placed the pages in order and clipped them, then wrote one line on the top. Draft timeline subject to verification. That line mattered. It showed we were careful, not theatrical. At 11:15 a.m., we drove to the county courthouse records desk. The building smelled like old paper and floor polish. People stood in line holding folders, looking tired. Alma told me, in indirect speech, not to stare, not to look nervous. She said we were not hiding. We were simply gathering public records that anyone could request. At the counter, Alma asked for recent filings and public inquiries connected to the Cade Family Celebration Fund, the wedding venue contract name, and any related business entities tied to Corbin Cade. She did not accuse. She did not threaten. She asked like an accountant who wants clarity. The clerk typed slowly and printed a few pages. Alma reviewed them with a calm face. I could not see everything from my angle, but I saw Alma's pen stop on one line. She asked the clerk, in indirect speech, to reprint a page with the timestamp header visible. The clerk did. Alma thanked him and placed the papers into a plain folder, then asked for one more thing. She asked for a receipt with the request code and time. The clerk printed it and handed it over. Outside, in the hallway, Alma said, in indirect speech, that someone had made a public inquiry tied to a name variation that looked like mine, close enough to pass a casual glance. She said it did not prove the whole plan, but it showed someone was touching systems around identity and authority. She said that matters because it supports intent. She said when people are clean, they do not need almost your name to do business. At 1:05 p.m., I sat with Alma in a courthouse cafe area with plastic chairs and a smell of burnt coffee. Alma spoke plainly. She said, in indirect speech, that Winnie and Corbin were trying to build a paper shield. She said they were likely trying to secure venue control, donor messaging, and bank-facing authority before the dinner. She said the dinner was not just a meal. She said it was a stage where Winnie planned to show the town she won. I asked Alma what my role was now. Alma said, in indirect speech, that my role was to stay calm and let them keep writing their own case against themselves. She said we would not confront. We would not post. We would not argue at church, in stores, or at family events. She said we would collect, preserve, and time. At 2:20 p.m., I received a message from Mason. He said in indirect speech that Winnie was stressed and that I should stop involving lawyers. He said the bank was overreacting and that this could be fixed privately. He said I should meet Corbin to clear confusion and that refusing would embarrass Winnie in front of donors. The word donors returned again like a drumbeat. It told me Winnie cared more about the audience than the truth. I did not respond. I sent it to Alma. Alma replied with a simple instruction. She said, in indirect speech, to answer only once and only with a neutral line. She wrote the line for me. All communications regarding any fund, contract, or payment must go through counsel. I copied it and sent it to Mason. Then I stopped. At 3:10 p.m., a message came from Corbin. Corbin said, in indirect speech, that he had a vendor emergency and that if I did not sign a release, the venue might cancel certain partner benefits. He said it would be my fault when people asked questions. He said Winnie was trying to protect my image, but I was making it impossible. The message was half threat, half fake kindness. It was pressure in a suit. I forwarded it to Alma and did nothing else. I could feel the urge to defend myself rising. I could feel the old instinct to explain, to fix, to make peace. But I also remembered the foyer, the way Winnie smiled while she removed me in front of strangers. Peace was not what she wanted. Control was. At 4:40 p.m., I walked into my garage workshop and sat on the stool. The smell of sawdust and old oil grounded me. I looked at the tape measure on the bench and thought about distance. I thought about how far my son had moved away from the values I tried to teach him. I also thought about how systems do not care about emotions. Systems only care about authority and records. That was the only place I could stand safely now. At 6:05 p.m., Perry called and said Winnie had started calling relatives again. Perry said, in indirect speech, that Winnie told them I was unhinged and that I was threatening the family. Perry said Winnie also claimed I was trying to steal money meant for the wedding partners, and that the bank was on my side because I was playing victim. Perry sounded exhausted. I told her to keep saving everything and not to argue. Perry said she understood. At 7:22 p.m., a heavy envelope arrived in my mailbox. It was not a court summons. It was not a legal notice. It was something smaller and meaner. It was a printed thank you dinner invitation to Briar House. The paper was thick and expensive. The lettering was gold. The date was exactly 30 days out. My name was printed on the guest list page at the bottom in small text, but there was a thin black line drawn through it by hand, like someone wanted me to see I was invited and uninvited at the same time. My throat tightened. My hands stayed steady. I placed the invitation on the table and photographed it from 3 angles. I did not crumple it. I did not throw it away. I treated it like evidence, because that is what it was. It was a message. It said she planned to erase me again, in public, in front of witnesses. At 7:40 p.m., Alma called. I told her about the dinner invitation and the line through my name. Alma was quiet for one moment. Then she said, in indirect speech, that Winnie just gave us the final arena in writing. She said Briar House would be full of donors, staff, and people who care about appearances. She said it was the perfect place for truth to land, because truth is louder when it arrives inside a performance. At 8:05 p.m., Alma told me the next step. She said, in indirect speech, that we would prepare filings quietly and hold them until the morning of that dinner. She said the timing would make the consequences immediate and public. She said Winnie would not get to rewrite the scene later. Then Alma said one sentence that made the air feel heavier, like a door was closing behind us. She said the bank was ready to cooperate, and the moment we filed, the authority issue would stop being a family debate and become an enforceable fact. At 5:58 a.m., I was already in my garage workshop with the lights on low. The air was cold enough to make the metal tools feel sharp. My breath looked thin when I exhaled. I sat on the stool by my workbench and held a tape measure in my hand without using it. That is what waiting feels like when you are trying not to react. You pick up something familiar so your mind stays steady. My phone buzzed at 6:11 a.m. It was Perry. She said in indirect speech that Winnie posted again late at night. She said Winnie wrote that real families protect their image and that outsiders should stop clinging. Perry said Winnie also told relatives that I was trying to sabotage Mason's marriage. I did not argue with a screen. I asked Perry to send the screenshots and keep the originals. Perry said she already saved them in 2 places and wrote down the time she saw them. I told her she did good work, and I meant it. At 6:30 a.m., I made coffee and took 2 sips that tasted like nothing. My body was awake, but my mind was in a narrow tunnel. I kept thinking about the dinner invitation with the black line through my name. It was not just rude, it was a plan. It was the same move as the wedding foyer, only cleaner and more expensive. At 7:05 a.m., Alma texted me and said, in indirect speech, that Vesper agreed to another private meeting at the bank. Alma said she wanted me there, but she would do most of the talking. She said to dress plain and arrive early. She said timing and calm were the whole game now. At 8:10 a.m., I drove to Northgate Private Bank and parked in the same underground lot. The concrete smelled the same. The elevator still moved too quietly. When I walked into the lobby, the soft music and citrus scent felt almost insulting, like the building was pretending life is always smooth. The receptionist looked up and said my name like she recognized it. Then she guided me to the hallway with frosted glass again. Vesper met us at 8:32 a.m. in her office with blinds half closed. Alma sat across from her with a plain folder. I sat slightly to the side and kept my hands on my knees. Vesper spoke first and said, in indirect speech, that she appreciated Alma being involved because it made the process formal and clean. She said the bank could confirm the fund was connected to a structure tied to my relationship history, and she said it had governance conditions. Vesper did not slide papers across the desk. She did not open a binder and point to a paragraph. She only described the shape of it, careful and controlled. She said, in indirect speech, that the structure was designed to prevent misuse and to reduce reputational risk to the bank and the beneficiary framework. She said that misuse can include coercion, public humiliation used as leverage, and attempts to force signatures under pressure. When she said those words, my chest tightened because it sounded like she was describing my last 30 days without using names. Alma asked Vesper, in indirect speech, if the bank saw signature-chasing behavior connected to the celebration fund, and whether that behavior looked consistent with normal vendor processing. Vesper said no. She said there were irregular inquiries and attempted authorizations that did not align with standard procedures. She also said the bank preserved records and was prepared to respond to lawful requests and notices. Alma asked, in indirect speech, if a formal filing would cause the bank to pause actions tied to that fund. Vesper said yes. She said the bank could place controls that stop further misuse once proper notice was in place. She said those controls were designed to prevent a situation from becoming worse while facts were verified. She did not call anyone a criminal. She did not accuse anyone by name. She only confirmed the bank was ready to follow the written framework when the correct switch was pulled. Alma nodded once and asked, in indirect speech, about timing. Vesper said timing mattered because certain actions in the system would become irreversible once vendor payments and partner acknowledgments were finalized under the wrong authority. She said the dinner date mattered because public sponsor claims create reputational assertions the bank then must address. She said a bank does not like being used as a decoration for someone's social stage. I sat still and listened. I did not feel proud. I felt the weight of it. I thought about Mason standing beside Winnie, letting her erase me. I thought about how the same people now leaned on bank structures like they understood them. They did not. They treated contracts like props. Vesper asked me, in indirect speech, if I had authorized anyone to speak for me regarding that fund. I said no. I said I did not authorize Winnie, Corbin, or Mason to use my name or my relationship with the bank to support their image. My voice was calm, but it sounded older than I wanted. Vesper nodded and said the bank noted that statement. At 9:05 a.m., Alma ended the meeting and said, in indirect speech, that she would proceed through formal channels and keep everything clean. Vesper said she would cooperate and said she had a trust liaison who could appear when needed. Alma said she understood. We stood and shook hands with the quiet stiffness of people who know the next step will be public. In the elevator down, Alma said, in indirect speech, that the other side was nervous and that nervous people make mistakes. She said we were close to the moment where they could no longer control the story with smiles. She told me to keep the same rule. No direct meetings, no arguments, no signature. She said that rule would protect me. At 9:40 a.m., I was back in my garage workshop. The sunlight came through the small window and landed on the workbench, making dust float like slow snow. I sat on the stool and listened to the quiet. I could almost hear the ballroom music again, even though it was just my memory playing tricks. I set the tape measure down and opened my notebook. I wrote the bank meeting time, Vesper's confirmation, and the phrase governance conditions. I did not add emotion, I did not write insults, only facts. At 10:12 a.m., my phone buzzed. It was Mason. I watched it ring until it stopped. A voicemail came in. Mason said, in indirect speech, that Winnie was panicking because donors were asking questions about the celebration fund. He said Corbin was saying the bank was being difficult. Mason said this could still be fixed privately if I just met them and signed a simple release. He said it would prevent embarrassment. He said he wanted peace. He said he did not want his marriage to start with legal conflict. I felt a dull ache behind my ribs. Peace was the word Mason used when he meant surrender. I forwarded the voicemail to Alma and wrote the time in my notebook. Then I placed my phone face down and breathed through my nose, slow and controlled. At 10:30 a.m., Perry arrived without knocking, like she forgot the rule because she was worried. She stepped into the garage and said, in indirect speech, that Winnie called her and demanded she stop helping me. Perry said Winnie warned her that staying on my side would make Perry unwelcome at family events. Perry's hands were tight at her sides. I told her she should not answer Winnie. I told her Winnie was trying to isolate me by threatening anyone who stayed near me. Perry nodded and said she understood, but she looked like she wanted to scream. I asked Perry to sit. I asked her to describe what Winnie said in exact words. Perry repeated it carefully, like she knew it mattered. She said Winnie talked about class again. She said Winnie bragged about the dinner and said it would be the moment the town saw the real family. Perry said Winnie also claimed I was a bitter old man trying to control Mason. I listened without interrupting, then asked Perry to send me the call log screen and to write down the time of the call. Perry did it quietly, then set her phone down like it was hot. At 11:05 a.m., another message came in, this time from Corbin. Corbin said, in indirect speech, that the venue needed a final sponsor confirmation and that he could not proceed without my cooperation. He said he did not want to involve outsiders, meaning lawyers. He said he had a notary ready and could come to my house. He said I should be reasonable. He ended with a line that sounded like a warning. He said if I forced legal action, people would remember who caused the collapse. I stared at the message until the words blurred a little. I did not respond. I sent it to Alma. Then I turned my phone off for 10 minutes. Not because I was afraid, but because I could feel the pressure trying to enter my body through a screen. At 12:10 p.m., Alma called. Her voice was calm and firm. She said in indirect speech that Corbin's message was helpful because it showed intent to pressure and manipulate sponsor authority. She said she was finalizing the filings, but she would hold them until the morning of the dinner, exactly as planned. She said she also confirmed the dinner guest list included donors, venue management, and a bank liaison in attendance, because Winnie invited partners to make the night look official. Alma said Winnie was building her own witness pool. I asked Alma what I needed to do between now and then. Alma said, in indirect speech, that I needed to stay consistent. She said if Winnie tried to bait me into a public scene, I should not take it. She said I should not show up anywhere unexpected. She said the trap works best when the other side feels safe enough to perform. At 1 p.m., I sat in the garage and looked at the empty space where I used to keep Mason's childhood toolbox. I remembered him at 12, insisting he could carry heavy boards alone. I remembered his pride when he succeeded. I wondered when pride turned into shame, and when shame turned into obedience to the wrong person. At 2:20 p.m., Mason arrived in the driveway. I saw his car through the garage window before he knocked. My stomach tightened, but my face stayed calm. I stepped outside and left the garage door open behind me, like a simple signal that I had nothing to hide. Mason stood with his hands in his pockets and his eyes wet. He said, in indirect speech, that he was tired. He said Winnie was screaming at him every night about money and image. He said Corbin was pressuring him to handle me. He said he felt trapped. I told Mason, in indirect speech, that he was not trapped. I told him he could choose truth. I told him he should stop chasing signatures and stop trying to make me disappear. Mason's jaw worked like he was chewing something hard. He asked me, in indirect speech, what Alma was doing. He asked if I was trying to punish Winnie. I told him I was trying to protect myself. I told him the easiest way to avoid punishment was to stop doing things that require punishment. Mason's eyes fell to the garage and then back to me. He said, in indirect speech, that Winnie told him I was nothing, and that donors would never respect him if he looked weak. He said he wanted to be respected. He said he wanted to be a man in their world. I felt a quiet sadness settle in my chest. Mason wanted respect from people who only respect leverage. I told Mason one sentence, slow and clear. I told him that respect bought with cruelty is not respect. It is permission to be used. Mason blinked fast and looked away. He said, in indirect speech, that he did not know how to stop it. I told him he could start by not signing anything else, not asking me to sign anything, and not letting Winnie speak for him in court or in public. Mason did not promise. He only nodded once, like the truth hurt but also relieved him. Mason walked back to his car and paused. He said, in indirect speech, that the dinner was supposed to be a victory lap. He said Winnie planned to announce future projects and talk about sponsors. He said she wanted to make sure everyone saw her as the new center of the family. Then Mason said something that made my spine straighten. He said Corbin told Winnie there was a clause somewhere that could ruin everything if I made trouble. He said they were trying to find it and neutralize it before the dinner. I did not react. I did not ask questions. I only said I understood. Mason got in his car and drove away slowly, like he was afraid the road might change under him. At 4:05 p.m., Alma texted me 2 words, tomorrow morning. Then she followed with a longer message. She said, in indirect speech, that filings would be submitted early, notices served properly, and the bank would activate controls immediately after confirmation. She said I should arrive at Briar House early and say almost nothing. She said the other side would talk plenty for me. At 5:20 p.m., I sat alone in the garage as the light faded. The air cooled again. The tools on the wall looked like silent witnesses. I felt tired, but I did not feel confused. The pieces were in place. The pressure messages were saved. The bank was ready. Alma was ready. The dinner stage was set by Winnie herself. At 6:15 p.m., my phone buzzed one last time. It was Winnie. She said in indirect speech that I could still fix this by apologizing publicly and staying out of the dinner. She said if I showed up, she would have me removed again, and everyone would see what kind of man I was. I saved the message, wrote the time, and put the phone down. At 7:02 p.m., Alma called and spoke with calm certainty. She said in indirect speech that tomorrow was the day. She said we would file in the morning, and by dinner, Winnie and Corbin would not control anything anymore. At 6:18 p.m., I entered Briar House and sat quietly near the back. Winnie stood to toast, smiling like a queen, and said, in indirect speech, that class always wins. Alma stepped beside me and handed the manager legal notice. Vesper's liaison confirmed, in indirect speech, that sponsor authority was frozen and control shifted under the fund rules. The room went silent as staff stopped service. Corbin tried to protest, but the manager said, in indirect speech, that decisions were no longer theirs. Mason's face collapsed. Winnie's smile cracked. I did not speak. I simply watched their stage become a record.